Hey there, welcome to the Bronx Buzz. This is Bronx Net's program where we talk to reporters and writers and editors and journalists, all the people who are writing stuff about the Bronx. In our first segment today, we're going to talk to a reporter from the city who covers the Bronx. In our second segment, we have an author who has done kind of or he's working on a novel that really pinpoints some things in Bronx history. So we're going to talk about that. But let's right now go to the Bronx Reporter for the city. It is our buddy Jonathan Custodio. Nice to have you with us once again, Jonathan.
Pleasure to be here.
Let's just start with rent stabilization. The rent board approved 3% hike for stabilized tenants. Wasn't quite what they wanted, and it wasn't what advocates wanted. It's a compromise, but of course, every time the rent goes up, nobody's certainly tenants aren't happy.
Yeah, like you said, it's a compromise, but no one's really happy with what the decision was. It's 3% for 1 year leases, and then for 2 year leases, it's 2.75% in year one, and then 3.2% in year two of those 2 year leases. These are going to apply to leases signed on or after October 1st later this year, and these are for rent stabilized apartments, about which there are a million. Tenants have said that any sort of increase is going to put them on the streets, saying that it's not, this isn't an equally affecting decision.
Right.
Whereas landlords have been saying, they have not been able to sustain operating expenses and
That's
maintenance
the
expenses.
problem. Let's see. It was excuse me. It was a 5-4 vote,
Mhm.
and is there? Is it? Do you view it as a journalist? Do you view it as a compromise, or is it? Is there another way to handle it? I mean, I know that the meeting itself, the vote itself, it gets chaotic, and obviously there's passions on both sides. How do we evaluate the whole thing that got us to that point, or is that the only way to do it?
I mean, both people on the board and the Rent Stabilization Association, which represents about 25,000 owners representing rent stabilized apartments, have use this vote again to sort of call for a reform of the rent guidelines board and how these rates are determined. It remains to be seen, what kind of steps will be taken toward that process. But it feels like this is kind of the compromise that these votes tend to go this
Yeah.
direction. And like with the final vote, it wasn't any shocker as the preliminary vote kind of suggested that these were the rates that we're going to reach.
Yeah, this was the direction it was going. The board members are appointed by the mayor,
Yes, yes.
so that this gets into. I mean, Eric Adams has been an interesting figure coming from the Democratic side, but many of the things that he's supported aren't always traditional Democrat values.
Right, right, and that's often been a theme of his campaign when he first became a mayor, and his tenure so far, where he sees himself as progressive, but many people don't put him in that kind of
Yeah.
traditional values. This is the second straight year where rents have risen under his watch. Compared to De Blasio, where 3 of the 8 years of his term there was a rent freeze. So
And excuse me, and maybe that really fits the profile of both mayors. This is the largest increase. We never had an increase like that in the De Blasio years. Presumably, that's because he picked people who would look that way when it came to voting on these things.
Right, right, absolutely. Ultimately, while the RGB is an independent board, ultimately every member is appointed by the mayor. The
Mhm.
majority of members have been appointed by Adams, while some are holdovers from De Blasio. But ultimately, this
Well, there
is
you go. Yeah, there's your 5-4 vote. And all right, well, we'll keep our eyes on, does homelessness increase? Are people going to be put out on the street? But that is the reality. I want to get into another distinctly Bronx issue, and that is the whole idea of neighborhoods being saturated with homeless shelters. Community boards 5 and 6 are not too happy with what's potentially happening on Webster Avenue. Why don't you give us a little background there?
yeah. So there's a shelter that is proposed and pretty much planned to be established this year on 2248 Webster Avenue. in Fordham, and it's right behind PSX 137 school
That's
campus.
right.
And it's been a reminder of how many shelters are in that area. I believe there's around 10 shelters within a half a mile
Wow.
of that shelter already. And, both boards feel that they've had too many shelters and other ones haven't really picked up the slack. And the most recent data from the Department of Homeless Services does suggest that there are some more affluent community districts that don't have either no shelters or very little. The city has tried to done its share in terms of increasing that, particularly in Staten Island. There was one in Billionaires Row put on, I think, a couple of years ago. But it's still the Bronx still very much outpaces pretty much every other borough.
I got the numbers from your article. The Bronx has 41% more shelters than Queens, which is 109 compared to 75. Even though the Bronx has a million fewer residents. And let's see, Manhattan with 1.6 million residents has fewer shelters than the Bronx, which has 1.4 million residents. So there's no question that the Bronx has, the burden. Here's the philosophical question, or even the logistical question: if more people are homeless in the Bronx, does it make sense to have more shelters here? And I'm playing devil's advocate. Not that community boards are going to be happy with me saying that,
Mhm.
um, or is it better to really spread it out and share the love, so to speak? I mean, I know people in the East Bronx have very strong feelings about that.
Yeah. Um, Theoretically, I suppose, but just like housing, you just need to build these locations to house
I think
people,
so.
right? And it doesn't really matter where they're placed, or rather, it doesn't really need to be placed in all one same location. People just want to have stable housing, and obviously, when you if you're living your whole life in the Bronx, you like to stay there. But I think the top priority for those people who are experiencing homelessness would just be to be in a stable situation.
Wherever it is.
Yeah, no,
But and here's the other thing: the reason that people don't like it is because they think people who are homeless are going to do the wrong thing, or create bigger problems than just the space that they live in. If the city is doing it with enough supportive services around it, with selecting a place where there is shopping and healthcare and education and schools, maybe that would do better. But a lot of times they select these places and then they still have a transportation problem to get somewhere, or they don't have enough supportive services. And so, the other, you've got a community that doesn't work. The other issue, which I do want to ask you about, is the top down aspect. I mean, both community boards were like, wait a minute, you didn't even discuss this with us. And this is certainly in my years of broadcasting on BronxNet, not the first time we hear this. Is there any, and I believe your article did not have, in fact, DHS didn't even come to the meeting, right?
they did not come to the meeting. They were a no
That's
show.
not helpful.
Yeah, yeah, which people were very, very quick to point out. And I think both boards managers, district managers pointed out to me that once they hear about a shelter, the shelter's pretty far into the process, that it's hard to
Yeah,
even.
so they don't hear about it. Oh my goodness.
Right, that it's really hard to
Try
make.
and stop it now.
Yeah, yeah. Any decision at that point, and Rafael Morpune, which is the CB6 district manager, he said a lot of developers come to the Bronx because they're it's cheap land, and ultimately they're there just trying to make a dollar. And he's called for DHS to have more geographic placement in terms of shelters, have more of a geographic priority, perhaps maybe a threshold for districts who already have a certain number of shelters, not
Mhm.
getting more shelters until other ones meet
And,
another.
and I wonder if down the road, and maybe with, frankly, with a women-controlled city council, there would now be, because you mentioned this in your article, be a definition of what is the fair share. In other words, it's not just targeting one neighborhood or another. Have an actual formula of some sort that would be in the legislation, whether it goes into the city charter or whatever it is, some regulation because again, the numbers are rather stark. I mean, it's obvious that the Bronx gets abused. Before we run out of time, I want to ask you about a nice thing. The Bronx Opera House down there in the South Bronx, right there in the hub, you noted could become a landmark. That's a really fun and interesting prospect, isn't it?
Yeah, so actually it just did last week.
Well, they did make it a landmark. I guess your article was previous to that.
Yeah. So
I didn't realize that. Isn't that? I'm gonna applaud.
yeah, about maybe a week or two after
I didn't realize that. Okay.
they finally did their vote. It was unanimous, 9-0, and they finally made it a landmark. And this is a place that was since 1913. It's kind of been stage theater, movie theater, dance hall, where many New Yorker musicians really brought their culture and the pachanga dance craze, and particularly in the 1980s and 70s. Early on in the century, it was put on opera shows and Broadway, and had uh, famous names like George Cohen, who was a very noteworthy performer back in the day and was nicknamed
Right.
the man.
George M. We're talking about George M. Cohen.
George M. Cohen, right.
Right.
So I learned a lot of stuff that I just had no idea about, and I think that that's what the LPC hopes too as the
You
space.
know, I tell people that we invented everything here in the Bronx, and these are the places. That's why it's so important. But now it exists as a hotel now, right? I mean, is that
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
where it's at?
it
Yeah,
exists as a hotel down there in Mott Haven in the South Bronx, and the owner has done a pretty good job of maintaining a lot of the historic features in the Italian Renaissance style that it was built.
right. Right, and these things are just so important. Now, of course, people who own those properties sometimes are upset because it means they can't always make changes, and it's got to go through the Landmarks Commission. But I think this is a good to preserve it, because the next thing you know, some developers say, "Oh, we want to knock it down and build up something else," and especially in a busy area like that. So, anyway, Jonathan Custodio from the city, thank you so much. Your work is so important to us. And we certainly expect we're going to ring your chime again and call you and have you come back on the show at some point.
Thank you. Ring away. Happy to
Yeah,
be here.
yeah, it's great. Listen, thank you so much, Jonathan. What we're going to do now, we will take a short break. And when we come back, a Bronx author is working on a book that is a novel that extends into Bronx history. So don't go away.